All right. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us this morning. And I hope everybody had a safe holiday with friends and family. And thanks for joining us this Monday after Thanksgiving. I know that's a bit of an ask. So my name is Patrick Hedger, and I'm the Vice President of Policy of the Taxpayers Protection Alliance Foundation, a nonprofit, nonpartisan taxpayer and consumer advocacy group based in Washington, D.C. I'm delighted to be your host for today's panel on competition and security in the app economy. Now, as the last 2 years have made painfully clear, secure and reliable access to a suite of software applications has become a critical need for Americans. While we hope to put this pandemic behind us soon, it's clear that the move to greater work, shopping, and entertainment online is here to stay. I mean, I should note that today, after all, is Cyber Monday, and I hope you're all taking advantage of that and getting some good deals. Yet, had it not been for this pandemic, I think you could argue that the biggest stories over the last few years, one of the bigger stories over the last few years would be the growing threat of cyber attacks. I mean, with all that's been going on in the news, one could be forgiven for forgetting that just over 6 months ago, a cyber attack on the Colonial Pipeline caused a run on gasoline up and down the East Coast. And every day, more and more businesses and other institutions find themselves victims of major data breaches and ransomware attacks. And of course, the ultimate victims of all of those things are the average consumer. On the other side of the tech policy space, we're seeing a major debate play out about competition. And I think while most can agree that ensuring competition that is robust in any sector is a good thing and a proper role of government, bipartisan legislation in both chambers of Congress stands to fundamentally alter both our understanding of competition and the structure of the tech sector broadly. So with such dramatic changes being considered for the tech sector and growing vulnerabilities in terms of cybersecurity with more points of attack as more and more Americans and devices get online, it's natural for us to consider and for the government to consider where is the interaction of these issues. That's why today the Taxpayer Protection Alliance Foundation is announcing the launch of our new initiative, the App Security Project. This project will focus on being the voice for consumers and education on cybersecurity concerns as policymakers in Washington consider changes to competition policy. You'll be able to find out more about this project at www.appsecurityproject.org. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to our panel of experts that we've assembled, and again, thank them for making the time right after the holiday for us to lend their insights and expertise. So the first person I'd like to turn to is Shane Tews to give us a threat assessment in terms of cybersecurity. Now, couldn't be happier to have Shane on the panel. Shane is a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where she works primarily on cybersecurity, technology, and innovation policy, and internet governance issues. Shane is also the president of Logan Circle Strategies, where she focuses on information communication technology and cybersecurity policy issues, including privacy, data protection, 5G, next generation networking, the Internet of Things, internet governance, and the digital economy. So with that, it seems she's more than qualified to give us an assessment of the cybersecurity threats that we face. And with that, I turn it over to Shane.
Thank you, Patrick. Well, mobile engineering learned a lot of lessons from the desktop era. Most of us are probably doing this on a desktop, but we spend a lot of time on our mobile devices as well. And so one of the things that mobile did is they built much more security by design into the devices that we use. A congressional research study in 2015 found that criminals increasingly rely on the internet and advanced technologies to further their criminal operations, both domestically and abroad. Criminals have easily leveraged the internet to carry out traditional crimes, such as distributing illicit drugs, sex trafficking, even just using this digital medium. So the mobile teams really have thought about what they couldn't prevent on the desktop that they're trying to do in mobile. In addition, these criminals are also exploiting the multiple angles of the digital world to facilitate crimes and are often technologically driven, including identity theft, payment card fraud, and intellectual property theft. Cybercrimes have an economic, public health, and national security implications, as well as consumer harms. So for over 3 decades, Congress has been concerned about the cybercrime and its related threats. And today, our concerns around cyber criminal activities are even stronger than when that report was written in 2015. Congress should be a leader in a larger discussion surrounding the multi-stakeholder role to ensure cybersecurity continues to be our top priority when we're drafting legislation. This means being vigilant and not creating unintended consequences through legal obligations, as this legislation potentially might do. We can't ignore security. We're trying to do, this is a quote I found from Steve Jobs in 2007. He said, "We're trying to do two diametrically opposed things at once: provide an advanced and open platform to developers while at the same time protect our iPhone users from viruses, malware, privacy attacks, etc." And it's no easy task. When Steve Jobs said that in 2007, I don't think he had any idea that one of our biggest concerns about cybersecurity would actually be passing legislation that would give some people some openings into the system. So we need to take notes of the negative effects and warnings about the diminishing of these security systems, and the members of Congress who have signed either onto the Senate or the House antitrust bills are only seeing the proposed political outcome that are not showing the negative consequences to our digital environment that they may create. This legislation is enacted, it has the potential to sow digital distrust among both personal devices and the things in our digital economy. This would happen through what is known as sideloading. It's an unapproved app on a device. The proposed legislation would create a legal obligation for companies to allow any software onto any device without an informed vetting process to ensuring an app being proposed. Now, I live and die by my cell phone, and I am always very curious, and I'm looking to see what is available in the App Store. And the idea that you could now use, I actually spent more money to buy something that I knew had a security measure on it. And Congress is basically saying that they're going to throw all of that aside to allow for more competition when it's really doing is putting security at risk. So to ensure each app and any of the software updates are evaluated, we need to see whether they meet the agreed upon standards. And in this case, I'm talking about the Apple App Store, but there are things that Android adds to the party as well, and Microsoft. We need to protect consumers by keeping malware, cyber criminals, and scammers out of these stores, which enables us to use and feel more secure and trust these devices with our more sensitive data. The European Union and Agency for Cybersecurity, known as ENISA, noted in 2016 that the use of official applications by marketplace only is what users should be considering. They should not be downloading applications from third-party sources to minimize the risk of installing a malicious application. Users should not sideload applications because they are not originated from the legitimate or authentic source. So this has been a concern since 2016. And in 2017, the Department of Homeland Security noted the best practice identified for migrating threats from vulnerable apps are relevant, that have relevant and malicious privacy invasion apps. It means you should avoid sideloading apps from any unauthorized app store. So this has been a known threat for quite some time, yet we're finding that this legislation is bringing this issue back up, and there seems not to be a large focus on it. In the recently released Munich Security Conference paper, it notes that we are now seeing a growing trend with many countries carefully vetting all new policies and regulations for their effects on climate change, or what they call climate proofing. But maybe we need to be thinking about our national security around our networks and the digital economy, and be considering the importance this is a priority, and consider security proofing to be a top policy priority. This means looking at these proposed legislation and regulations to ensure that they're enhancing our security capabilities, not diminishing them.
All right, thank you, Shane. Really appreciate that. And so, Shane, you touched on some of the bills that are being proposed right now in both chambers. We're seeing bipartisan legislation, a lot of rumbling about competition policy in the technology space. I want to turn it over now to Jeffrey Westling. Jeff is I'm happy to introduce him as the new Director of Technology and Innovation Policy at the American Action Forum, filling some big shoes there. And he's coming to the American Action Forum from the R Street Institute, where he was a research fellow resident fellow, on technology and innovation policy. He's also spent some time working at the FCC as a legal fellow, and has received his Juris Doctorate from the University of Colorado Law School. So very, very qualified to speak to issues of competition law and cybersecurity. So Jeff, why don't you give us a rundown of the state of the antitrust debate broadly, and a rundown of the bills that you see advancing and standing a good chance of actually maybe moving somewhere in Congress?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. This is awesome to come talk with you guys. And like you said, this is the debut of me at AAF on a panel, so I'm really excited to be here to share that with you. Just to speak pretty broadly about the state of antitrust right now. We've really gotten to a point where we're focused on the effects on practices on consumers. How does a particular thing affect the consumer? But we got there from a mindset back in the 30s and 40s and even into the 50s and 60s, where we had this idea that big is necessarily bad. And with some of this legislation that's coming back, we're starting to get back to that point a little bit where we're not focused so much on the effect that a specific legislation could have on the consumers, or a specific practice in particular could have on consumers, but rather, these companies were so worried about big tech, we need to do something to rein them in, and therefore we're going to pass legislation. And as you said, there's been a lot of legislative effort going towards that right now. And Shane talked about it a little bit, but just to dive in a little bit more specifically, there's a lot of different angles that Congress is taking right now to review the competition policy in the U.S. Most notably is the American Choice and Innovation Online Act. I'll go through that a little bit here in a minute, but before I do, just to kind of keep it broad, there's some other efforts as well, such as the Access Act, which is focused a lot more on interoperability and requiring platforms to be able to share information and let users take that information elsewhere. The idea of that being network effects are one of the key challenges for some of these platforms. And once you get some users on, it's hard to get away from that, because users want to be where users are. So that's kind of targeted toward those practices. There's also things like the Open Market Access Act and the Ending Platform Monopoly Act, which are both more targeted at structural separation between businesses that have like an online store and maybe selling products on that store, having an app store, and actually having apps within there. And then there's things like the merger review changes, and Senator Klobuchar's got some very drastic changes to competition policy as a whole that's not specifically targeted towards big tech, but there is a lot of implications there. But just to circle back on the American Choice and Innovation Online Act, I think that's kind of where a lot of the focus is going to be, and where I would like to spend some more of the time, because there's a lot of different changes in there. And the first thing that it does is it has some blanket restrictions on advantaging your own products versus other competitors on that same store. And when it comes to app security and app stores, is that theoretically, if you have an app that's in your own app store, you can't really favor that. Well, what if your app is a lot more secure? You're much more focused on cybersecurity, mitigating threats. You're targeted at all these different bad actors and preventing them from getting into the system. Well, if you are ranking your apps based off that, you have to be very clear that that is what, like, the specific standard, because it could look very much like you're favoring your own app versus one that might not have those own security issues. Now you have to go to court to defend that practice, and theoretically you're opening up the apps to much more security vulnerabilities. It also makes it unlawful to impede or basically ban interoperability with platforms. It's basically forcing companies like Apple to host all these different apps. Shane talked about this a bit with the sideloading issue, but there's just a lot of issues with kind of bypassing and forcing access, because when you have a system designed for security, any kind of weak point can really become a problem for the whole network as a whole and the whole device as an individual thing. And it's really important to understand that when we are targeting these interoperability requirements, we're trying to force companies like Google and Apple to allow different apps into their stores, or to bypass the store entirely, that you're opening up more vulnerabilities. And just throughout the bill, there's a lot of language in there that's problematic. And there's things about restricting communications between app developers and the users. And theoretically, they're trying to target companies sending out information about getting around the payment authorization mechanisms. But in practice, that's one of the most common ways of attacking users, is to phish and send links where they're like, hey, this is a link that you should click on because this is going to allow you to use our thing. You click on the link, and now you've just opened up your device to more attacks. And theoretically, if you have laws that prohibit the companies from mitigating those communications and opening up the access to more and more companies, you're just increasing the threat vulnerabilities there. So I think this is all a long-winded way of saying that there's a lot of different legislation out there targeting different parts of the competition ecosystem as a whole, but there's always going to be unintended consequences. Right now, competition law is focused on those consumer effects, and when you're defending a specific practice in the courts, you're going to say, look, yes, we maybe don't allow these people onto our app. Here's why. This is because it's better for consumers if we don't allow this, because their devices are going to be secure. They know they're going to have an app that is trusted and vetted by our app store, and it's going to lead to more secure devices. So those kind of pro-competitive, pro-consumer justifications carry a long weight. I worry if we go away from those pro-consumer, pro-competitive analysis from the courts and back to kind of this biggest bad, let's just go after these companies because they're large and we want to make it easier for people to compete, we might mitigate some of those pro-competitive, pro-consumer benefits.
All right, thanks, Jeff. I really appreciate that. Now, I want to turn it over to Michael Mandel, who's joining us from the Progressive Policy Institute, and really appreciate you joining us, Michael. So Michael is the, excuse me here, sorry. Michael has written a paper on the benefits of scale in cybersecurity called the American Innovation Under Threat, Restrictive Legislation and Global Competition. Michael Mandel is the Vice President and Chief Economist at the Progressive Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. He's also a Senior Fellow at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania and a Fellow at the Manufacturing Policy Initiative at Indiana University. He was Chief Economist at Business Week prior to its purchase by Bloomberg. So, Dr. Mandel, could you talk a little bit to us about this paper, American Innovation Under Threat, Restrictive Legislation and Global Competition, and what I guess the thesis of the paper is, and how that interacts with the discussion that we're having.
Thanks very much. I'm very glad to be here today. Let me just actually emphasize that this paper was written not by me, but by two Duke University researchers, Ashish Arora and Sharon Belenzon, okay, who actually put together a fantastic set of data on the links between these antitrust bills and then the research capabilities of corporate America. But before going on, let me state really clearly, reiterate what Shane and Jeff said about the impact of these bills. These bills have very broad language addressing self-preferencing, discriminatory behavior, and so forth. There are very broad language. They have very large fines, and they don't have any safe harbors. There is some language about security, but it's hard to know exactly what it means. And so the problem is that you're dealing with a situation where companies may be forced into taking actions to protect themselves that are not optimal, either in the short run or the long run for consumers. Short run, obviously, there's going to be the potential for the platform companies having to relax some of their security measures. The mention of side loading, the mention of weaker vetting of apps. And these are real possibilities because the bills make it a possibility that these companies will be prosecuted for these behaviors. But then there's a broader issue as well. We're in a world in which corporate research and development is extremely important across a wide range of areas, but especially in cybersecurity. And companies that have scale and scope have an incentive to invest in ways that smaller companies do not. And so you look what's happened in the innovation ecosystem in the US in recent years. And if you want to sort of look at this paper, the data for this paper, incidentally, it's on our website for the Innovation Frontier Project, innovationfrontier.org. And it's fantastic data that the two Duke University researchers have put together. What they do is they make the point that the innovation ecosystem in the US consists of three legs. One leg is government funding. One leg is startups, which is VC funding. And then there's corporate research. And the point that they make is that corporate research at this point is being done by a relatively small number of companies, some of whom are under attack, who are the direct focus of these antitrust bills. And if you look at the broader scope of these antitrust bills, what they're intended to do is they intentionally or unintentionally, they will have the effect of reducing the scale and scope of these companies and making it harder for them to invest in research, including research into cybersecurity. And so we're looking at a situation in which our security will be reduced, not just in the short run for the reasons that we have talked about already, but in terms of new threats as well. The ability to adapt will be slowed down, and will measurably reduce our security going forward. So if we're thinking about the big picture, it doesn't make sense to handicap the companies that are at the forefront of cybersecurity research globally, because the net result will be bad for US consumers, for US national security, and for the US economy.
All right, thank you, Dr. Mandel. Appreciate you sharing that. And we put the link to this paper in the chat, so hopefully everybody can see that and read it for themselves. Shane, I want to come back to you. Something that you said that really stuck out to me, and that I've heard in this debate before, is a discussion about the difference between laptops and desktops and smartphones. And that, you know, I've heard folks say that are supportive of this legislation to more open up the smartphone ecosystem, that we have a more open app and software ecosystem in desktops and laptops. Why can't we have that in the smartphone space? Could you expand a little bit on that?
Sure. So first of all, I'm a huge admirer of apps. You got to think back to a lot of us who've been online for a long time, and downloading software to your laptop used to be really cumbersome, took a long time, took a lot of space, still takes a lot of space, candidly. But the ability for it to not only download, but immediately interact with the other pieces on your computer are I find amazing. But at the same time, but it was designed really with mobile in mind, and then they backtracked it onto the laptop. And what we learned in the mobile space was the importance of vetting ahead of time any of the risk security analysis on what could possibly go wrong when somebody tries to download a piece of software onto your mobile device, or now backing that into your laptop. And the main thing that we have is the ability, as we learn in life, is time. When you learn that there's something that goes wrong and it consistently goes wrong, you put that into your risk analysis. And part of that risk analysis says, you know, how do I stop bad things from happening? And so what they've done in something like the App Store is they've looked at the complexity of all the probables that could happen and said, we're going to basically migrate off anything that causes these problems. We're not going to allow them. And that is part of a security measures, because you look at repetition of things that, you know, how you get malware, how you get bad things on your computer, and you figure them out. So a robust security operation function restores, you have to look at the present, what is immediately happening. We're seeing a lot in ransomware. You have a great compliance function, hopefully, which ensures you to look back and see where, you know, challenges were and how you kept your system safe. But thoughtful risk management protects you from the future. And that's what you're trying to do with the App Store, is say, we know that these things cause problems. We're going to keep them away from the App Store. We have now figured out how to migrate that back onto a laptop. But those of us that are sitting in front of laptops realize that all of that technology we are garnering from the people that learned how to make mobile apps more secure.
So Jeff, you talked about sort of the changes that we're seeing broadly in terms of competition policy, changes that folks want to make. And that is a bit of a move away from the consumer welfare standard as we know it. Do you feel that consumer welfare is being neglected in terms of looking at it from a cybersecurity perspective, or just a security perspective in general? And that, you know, do you believe that the current standard that we have now would sufficiently, when we talk about consumer welfare standard, most folks are thinking of prices, but do you think current law sufficiently encapsulates things like qualitative issues like security? And do there need to be changes there, or does there need to be a greater focus on those sort of qualitative consumer welfare aspects?
Yeah, I think the beauty of the current antitrust law is that it is very, you know, fact and case specific. And when you're looking at different practices like cybersecurity, that's always going to factor in to the analysis. If you have a platform that is focused very exclusively on cybersecurity and therefore excludes different apps from joining it, or from you know, allowing different parties to access it, there's a good pro-competitive reason for that. So I think the current law almost incentivizes companies to be able to go and take those kind of more risk-averse strategies, and at the same time, it also allows companies to take less risk-averse strategies. We have different ecosystems right now, where you have a closed ecosystem with Apple, and you have a little bit more open ecosystem with Google's Android. But they both, you know, take security very seriously. And at the same time, consumers have that choice now, where it's, if I want a little bit more flexibility in my app store, and I want a little bit more, you know, ability to go out and download products that I want, I have that ability to do that. And if I want that really secure platform, if I want to go with something that I know is very walled off from potential harms, I can do that as well. The consumer welfare standard really allows that, and the focus on competition as a whole allows that, because we're incentivizing companies to do things that theoretically are excluding competition, but for very good pro-competitive reasons. And those pro-competitive reasons obviously outweigh a lot of the anti-competitive concerns there. So I think that's just the key to remember, is that the consumer welfare standard, the current antitrust law regime as it stands now, is focused on those kind of trade-offs and looking at whether the practice in particular is pro-competitive as a whole, and not necessarily pro-competitive in the sense that it's going to help out your competitors. That's not what antitrust law should be focused on, and that's what I think a lot of these bills lean into a little bit sometimes. And just to reiterate, just for my own sake, the AAF doesn't take any specific stances on the legislation. I'm just speaking kind of broadly about the policy implications there, but just wanted to reiterate that before I get in trouble on my second week on the job.
Oh, we appreciate that, Jeff. Thank you for that perspective. Dr. Mandel, something that you mentioned that I wanted to get back to is the idea of safe harbors, because there's a lot that we can say that we can be against, right, in terms of changes to policy. But we've seen safe harbors in other areas of tech policy create some success in terms of platforms, policing content and getting rid of bad actors. What are some things that folks should focus on in terms of having solutions that both promote cybersecurity and competition without sacrificing some of the benefits to consumers in terms of having a smartphone that works and it doesn't become loaded with malware just because you've downloaded a new application?
Well, if you think about safe harbors, in the case of antitrust policy, we're talking, both about the consumer welfare and also about innovation. Okay, and the idea here is that a company that has gotten a strong market position through its innovative capabilities should be able to rely on that to sort of say, this is a good thing. We don't beat up people. We don't beat up companies that have achieved a lot of sales because they produce better products or better services. So that's it's a consumer welfare standard plus a little bit more, okay, relying on innovation. And I think if you sort of thinking about the innovation ecosystem as a whole, there's a lot of problems that are best dealt with by companies that have scale and scope, whether or not it's in healthcare, or whether or not it's in cybersecurity or autonomous vehicles or quantum computing. They're problems that are large-scale problems. And in the case of cybersecurity, we really want to have a situation where companies know that they can invest in innovation, invest in improving their systems without worrying that somebody will sue them for, in the case of will sue them for violating self-preferencing or violating discriminatory behavior, which are broad language. So it's really what safe harbors do is that they focus attention on what's important. Okay? And it doesn't have to be a completely safe harbor. God only knows we're sort of debating the content regulations right now, and we will continue to debate them for a while, I think. But in a complicated world, it really helps focus the attention. So when I look at this legislation, I think the fact that it makes it difficult to tell innovative companies what they should be doing is a real minus for them.
Appreciate that. And this also speaks to a question that we've gotten from the audience. And I'd like to turn it over to, I asked you, Dr. Mandel, what do you see as some solutions here? I'd like to open it up to first Shane and then Jeff. Do you see any upsides or smart ideas that you like in some of the bills or reforms that are being proposed? And I guess just a similar question, what are things that folks should be for that continue to promote competition without harming innovation and harming cybersecurity for consumers?
think there's a lot to like in the marketplace. I'm not sure that any of them are in those bills. So to be really clear about that, I am very concerned. Somebody who has used, still misses Word perfect, honestly, because I like to reveal codes, but used Word. One of the things that was great about Word is that they actually incorporated the spell function on it. That wasn't something that Microsoft created. That was something that Microsoft bought. And that's really common in this space. So, you use the calendar or the mapping function of fill in your blank favorite, app creator. A lot of times that's something that was actually purchased from somebody else who brought that into space. If you're one of the top 5 tech companies, they're going to outlaw that. So they're now saying that, a lot of people, the way that they actually plan on going to their go-to-market strategy is to get big enough to get bought and then to incorporate into somebody else's larger platform. The fact that they want to deny this opportunity is the current best way to innovate in our space. And for saying you're not going to allow it really just hurts American companies and enables foreigners to take on the opportunities to buy these companies away from the American market. And that just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, and I'll jump in here too. I think just kind of going back to the big broad question of what could be good. And I agree with Shane that, I generally don't think we should be doing a lot because I think the market's working really well right now. But I think generally speaking, interoperability is a good thing. How we go about doing that is tricky when you start having the government coming and trying to mandate interoperability requirements. But I think the more open that you can make the platform while still keeping it secure and allowing more apps on your device is generally a good concept. So it's something worth exploring for the Hill and trying to find ways of doing that successfully. But I know like the Access app or ACTS in particular, they have, if I remember correctly, they had provisions in there that basically said that the commission, which I believe, I forget which commission it was, it might have been the FTC, but basically had to approve changes to your interoperability kind of platform and your internal processes for how to share data. And that's really problematic. And you want the companies to be able to respond quickly rather than having to go through government processes to change those processes and change those designs of your platform. So that's where I start getting worried is when we start having these bills. You need to be really careful about how you go about implementing it, but I don't think it's necessarily a terrible idea to be looking at ways to improve interoperability and making it easier to get around some of those network effects that are kind of one of the key challenges for competition in this space.
So again, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, you want to go ahead and follow up if you want.
No. I was just going to remind the audience that the Q&A function is open. We're open to more questions, but I'll let you go ahead.
No, I think I'm going to take this a little bit of a different direction. I mean, one of the papers that we've done for the Innovation Frontier Project that we commissioned sort of looked at the issues of technology diffusion. And I think that one of the things that we want to think about here, if we're thinking about not just consumers, but the rest of the innovation ecosystem, is to make sure that the research that large companies with scale and scope are investing in are diffuse fast enough to the rest of the economy. Okay, and part of that is actually by allowing them to take the innovations to market. Okay, if they take the innovation to market, what happens is other companies learn from that and are able to kind of move forward as well. So if you even think about the Zoom platform that we're on now, that grew out of the founder worked for Cisco, okay, and he sort of came out of there. And so what we want to do is we want to encourage sort of the idea that of no compete agreements, okay, non-compete agreements not being an acceptable form of control over intellectual property, sort of encouraging workers sort of for large companies to actually go out and start startups, okay, and as a way of spinning out the technology. One of the interesting problems in Germany is that it's actually very hard for workers at the large auto companies to spin out new auto startups, which is why the US has Tesla and Germany doesn't. And you want to sort of think a little bit sideways here. What are we trying to do? We're trying to sort of reinforce the entire innovation ecosystem. And the way to do that is not to pound at one leg and try to knock out one leg, but to actually sort of reinforce some of the other legs.
I also, sorry, just jump in here and say, remind you that malware is actually a marketplace for stolen goods. So when we're talking about the elements of the market, we're allowing a large open marketplace for criminals rather than trying to, protect consumers from that. So malware is stealing, it's stealing data, it's stealing access, and then it's selling the data or the access for a profit for the harm of the consumer and the user. And we're actually looking at that element of the market not being a market. And that's exactly what it is. So when you're favoring an illegal market from the idea of vetting it to keep us in a secure space, I've got to wonder where your priorities are.
Yeah, to exert a little moderator's privilege, I something that you said, Dr. Mandel, that stuck out to me was, the idea that you want folks that to start these new companies and take the ideas that they've seen that have worked elsewhere. And you're not going to have that if you see some of the changes that we've seen proposed in terms of acquisitions. Now, it's not just the opening up of the app stores and the other changes that we've seen in the proposed in the American Choice and Innovation Online Act, but we've also seen legislation proposed by both Senator Klobuchar and Senator Cotton that would prevent some of the largest players out there from entering the market and acquiring new startups beyond a certain market cap. So you're shutting off an area of investor and entrepreneur exit with some of these proposals, and that I think would certainly be problemative.
I'm not saying that there isn't the need for more regulation here. I think that if you look at the history of innovative industries going way back, that you can see, for example, in the auto industry, in the electronics, in the electric industry, in machinery industry, what happens is that as industries mature, you sort of learn what the problems are, okay, and then you try to sort of regulate them, but without killing the innovation, okay. And one thing that governments are actually good at, unfortunately, is killing innovation if they sort of ram down too hard. And we don't want to sort of go down that route. We want to go down the route of supporting innovation and supporting diffusion, and then making sure that we take care of consumers at the same time.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's a good note to allow you folks to go on to give us some of your closing remarks. Why don't we go in reverse order, I guess, that we started. So Dr. Mandel, I'll hand it over to you.
Well, I think this is, this is an exceptionally interesting period. Like I said, compared historically, we had antitrust actions against companies like General Electric and Kodak, but they did not try to sort of neuter the companies, okay? And that was to the benefit not just of consumers, but of workers too. And I think we have to think about that the tech e-commerce sector has become one of the single fastest driving forces for job growth in the economy, is sort of far exceeding healthcare at this point, and is producing good jobs, not just for people at the top, but for middle skilled workers as well. The wrong sort of legislation could actually destroy some of these benefits, not just in terms of cybersecurity, but in terms of labor as well.
All right, Jeff, we'll go to you next. Thank you for your remarks, Dr. Mandel. Jeff, we'll go to you next, and we'll ignore the question in the chat about breaking up the Suns, the Phoenix Suns, because of all their success in the NBA. So
16 straight. We're playing Golden State tomorrow, which is going to be a good one. Yeah, I think just to kind of close out and round out my thoughts is just to kind of reiterate the points that I've been making. Is just that we have a competition policy in the US that's really focused on the analysis of the specific facts of a case. Let's look at whether specific conduct is going to have good pro-competitive justifications for that conduct that outweigh any anti-competitive harms, and look at that balance. Look at the good that comes with potential harms to competition. And you see that with a lot of these different practices where, you could say, hey, if we don't allow other apps onto this app store, we don't allow rival firms into our closed ecosystem, that could make it harder for our competitors to stay afloat and compete. Well, that's not what the concern of antitrust laws is. How is this going to affect consumers? And there are really good reasons sometimes for excluding potentially bad actors or malicious actors from a closed ecosystem to ensure that the space stays secure and the device stays secure. And whether or not that rises, the specific action is going to be outweighing the pro-competitive justifications. That's a question that we should analyze and we should continue to look at. I don't want to make a blanket statement to say that every practice here is generally okay. It's no, let's look at the specific facts. Let's look at the effect on consumers and let's look at the actual analysis to determine whether this is good or bad. And I'm worrying that if we get back towards that biggest necessarily bad, we're going to forego that really rigorous analysis in the courts and just go back to a mindset of, hey, I don't like the fact that this company is big. I don't like the fact that this individual competitor is going to now go out of business because they can't keep up, regardless of whether that's going to be good or bad for consumers. So just my big point is just let's keep focused on this analysis and this effect on consumers.
Shane, I was hoping you could piggyback on something that Dr. Mandel discussed in terms of scale in your closing remarks, that we're not really looking just at threats to consumers from, a hacker in his mom's basement. We're talking about potentially nation state actors interfering in cybersecurity. Isn't that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the ability to dissuade people to do things that are important to them. We've been watching this with, unfortunately, with COVID. We've seen disinformation campaigns. We've seen a lot of things that are taking us in the wrong direction with the ability to use our digital networks. The digital economy has been a great benefit to the global economy, and the U.S. companies have led the way on innovation and adoption. And we need to be protective at all security levels that we can be. So when we think about the ability of scale, and we have global partners in this, and we need to be thinking about this issue globally. And the fact that our Congress is taking this interesting myopic view on punishing US companies, and then we see senators presenting in Korea 2 weeks ago about the wanting to back their legislation. I'm hoping that they will turn around and refocus on how great it is that we have innovated so much in the United States that we've shared with the world, but we need to then lock that up with the security measure. Otherwise, as I mentioned before, criminals will be the ones that'll be having the raging market in this space, not consumers and not the big companies that have actually led the way.
All right, I think that's a great note to end on. Just want to thank all of our panelists again for giving us their time. Again, the first work day back from a holiday. We really appreciate the insights that you offered from a perspective across the political spectrum, and a great amount of expertise to bring to bear to this conversation. So we look forward to continuing to have it. I would encourage you all to follow our panelists, follow their organizations and their work. They're all contributing thoughtfully to this, and we really appreciate you again joining us. So thank you. Again, keep watch of what we're going to be doing in this space. Again, the App Security Project is a new project of the Taxpayers Protection Alliance Foundation, where we're going to be looking in depth at these issues that we discussed today, and continuing to share work of folks like our panelists. And you'll be able to find that at, again, www.appsecurity.org. So with that, we'll give you guys back the rest of your day. We really appreciate you joining us, and thanks so much.
Thanks, Patrick.